All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another Zoom check-in. It has been so long, so thank you for joining us today. We are just so glad to see all of your faces on this Thanksgiving week. So thank you for giving us some of your time this week. We're really excited for our guest today and to be able to talk with you all a little bit more about some great ministry that's going on and things to come. So just some housekeeping. As always, if you have questions, we will have some time for question and answer today. So if you have any questions, feel free to chat them into the chat box that's at the bottom of your screen. So there's a little speech bubble that says chat. Feel free to make sure it goes to one of us so we can see it, but feel free to chat in any questions or comments you have along the way. And we'll make sure to get to those in the question and answer session. If we have an abundance of questions and for some reason we're not able to get to yours, we will follow up with you with an answer later because we want to make sure that all of your questions are answered. Some things coming up. We will be sharing Year of Vision resources in January, so be on the lookout. We will have a Bible reading plan again that we are very excited to share with you, some great stuff. Changing it up again for our third year, I believe, in a row. So that will be out, so you can start on January 1, and then we will have further resources for the Year of Vision in 2022 that we will share with you later in January. And then the rostered ministers gathering will be held virtually again this year. That will be January 25th, 26th, and 27th. They will not be full days. So it is 3 days of meetings, but not full days. I just want to reassure you. So be on the lookout for more information about how to join us virtually for that. Also, sure to be a good time. We got some great speakers this year. So again, questions can be sent via chat or to our info box, info@nwos-elca.church. We will be monitoring both throughout our entire time together. But without further ado, Bishop, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Caroline. Dear friends in Christ, it is good to be with you. I'm going to open with a devotion, and I'm going to begin with a reading from Exodus, the 3rd chapter. So be familiar, these should be some familiar words, the call of Moses. So I'm reading from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. This is the word of the Lord. I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on that reading and give some thought to this question. When you think of holy ground, or when you think of sacred space, what images and what places come to mind? If you'd be willing to go down to the chat feature, I'd just love for you to chat in what comes to your heart when you think of holy ground or when you think of sacred space. Vigil at a bedside, fonts, family homestead and church in Texas, honoring one who has passed at the funeral, cemeteries and parks, presiding at the table. A silent retreat house, a family meal, a home altar. I want to invite you back to 11 years ago. And I think back to June 6, 2010. And I'm standing in the middle of a farmyard where Erwin and Bernie Welling's home, barn, grain bins, and farm machinery used to be. I'm with their son, and we are picking up the pieces of a long life that was swept away at 11:05 the night before, when the Lake Township tornado touched down right on top of their farm. Do some of you remember the Lake Township tornado? The next morning, it was just the two of us, and we had to watch where we walked. The ground was covered with broken boards, shattered glass, twisted metal. I remember that we spoke in hushed voices as we searched for pictures, for a family Bible, for important papers. Later that same afternoon, there were dozens of people on that same ground, clearing debris. But what I noticed is that they too were clearing the debris in silence. It was a sacred moment, for the ground upon which we stood and labored was holy ground. It was about 2 to 3 days later, I think it was 3 days later, that Lutheran Disaster Response showed up. A woman named Lisa Mora was assigned to us as our caseworker, and she helped us organize everything. The sharing of water and food and clothing. She helped us with the distribution of tens of thousands of dollars that were coming in. She was there when we blessed many of the new homes that were built 4, 5, 6 months later. And she was still there when we dedicated the monument 1 year later for the 7 Lake Township residents who were killed from their injuries, including Erwin Welling, in whose farm I stood and who was a member of my congregation. When I think back of those days after the Lake Township tornado, I of course remember the great tragedy and all the devastation. But I remember also all of the people from all of the churches and the folks from Lutheran Disaster Response who came out to help and who journeyed with us as we together rebuilt the entire community. Lutheran Disaster Response helped us to do that. As they continue to do that sacred work on holy ground, both here in the United States and throughout the world. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Loving God, in the communion of Christ, we are joined together with all who suffer. Be with all of those who experience storms in their lives. Protect those in the path of any danger. Provide assistance to those who need help. Ease the fears of all, and make your presence known by the sacred stillness of your peace. This we pray through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. Dear friends in Christ, it is good to be with you. And we have a guest with us that I want to introduce you to. John Pyron is with us. And John is with us from Lutheran Disaster Response. John serves in the U.S. division, and we're glad to have him with us. Why don't we give him a warm Northwestern Ohio Synod welcome. Welcome, John. John, I'm going to invite you to unmute if you would, and would you just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and the passion you have for this important work?
Sure. Thanks, Bishop, and thanks to all of you for the invitation. It's good to be with you. As some of you may know, I was an Ohioan myself for about 5 years. My wife and kids and I lived in Dayton, and recently, just actually probably almost a year exactly ago, today we moved down to Louisville, Kentucky. So I bring you good Kentucky greetings from a fellow Ohioan at heart. So again, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for your continued support. It's always a pleasure to get to be with folks at synod and congregational levels to share about the important work with Lutheran Disaster Response. My road to where I am today has been an interesting one, I'll say that, and it's definitely marked with many instances of God's hand and at work in my life. I actually started in disaster response, unbeknownst to me, as a volunteer after Hurricane Ivan in 2004. I say I almost committed the two cardinal sins of disaster response. Number one, by deploying without connecting with anybody on the ground first. So spontaneous, unaffiliated volunteer could have been me. And also the second being, when I did affiliate, I realized I wound up connected with folks in Alabama, and thought, why am I going to Alabama? The hurricane hit Florida. So I made two cardinal sins of disaster response, not realizing that disasters do not respect state borders, and also almost becoming an unaffiliated volunteer. So my dad, thankfully, had the foresight to convince me to affiliate. So that's how I wound up in Mobile, Alabama after Hurricane Ivan, and the rest, they say, is a little bit of history there. So I started as a volunteer, leading a chainsaw team, doing debris removal, and then really felt, it's inexplicable really, but I just felt like I needed to be there. I didn't really know why. I didn't understand it. But our team coordinator, after the first day or so, he said the same thing. So then it was kind of a smile and a nod. And that was in October of 2004. And then fast forward to April of 2005, and I packed my car and moved to Mobile, Alabama from Western Kentucky, for a job that I really didn't know much about, but I knew I needed to be in Mobile. And then, if you remember 2005 at all, that was one of the most active hurricane seasons in a long time, including Hurricane Katrina. So then I was on the Gulf Coast for Hurricane Katrina and had the privilege of working with folks who were impacted across that tri-state region of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And then so stayed down in Mobile for a while, and met a girl, the classic story, met a girl, and then chased the girl to St. Louis. And that girl now is my wife of 12 years. And so went to St. Louis and kind of fell into an opportunity to work with the long-term recovery group in St. Louis. And then wound up working with Lutheran Family and Children's Services as the LDR coordinator for Missouri. And that's 2011, if you remember, was also the Joplin tornado. So worked in Joplin, worked across 25 counties in southern Missouri, coordinating response and recovery efforts for flooding and tornadoes. And then my wife got a job in Dayton, Ohio, and we took a leap of faith and moved to Dayton. And about that time, some of you may remember Mary Bates, Mary Woodward, who worked in the LDR Ohio kind of work for a long time. And I called her and said, hey, what does it look like, job wise in Ohio? And she said, why don't you just take my job? I'm going to retire. So that was again, kind of like, oh, okay, I get, I'll walk through that door. So worked with Lutheran Social Services of Central Ohio, and all the synods in Ohio for 5 years. And then God knocked again. And that's when the opportunity for to serve as the program director for Lutheran Disaster Response on the national level came around. So I say that I've had the distinct privilege of really seeing disaster response and recovery from the inside out, from the ground up. Also, as a experiencing disasters on my own as well. We did have I was probably 13, 14 at the time. There was a 100+ year old oak tree that came down on our house in a straight line wind gust and forked literally over the eave of our house. And between that fork is where my parents' bedroom was. So it laid on top of our house on side. And so, have seen a lot of those hands of God moments in the field of protection that can't be explained. So, and really feel like I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk with you guys and to share some of that story, and now be able to work with you at the national level and support all your work locally. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. I could probably talk for another 30 minutes, but I will hand the mic back over to the bishop.
Thanks. Yeah, as I shared in the devotion, we've had some experience here in Northwest Ohio with tornadoes, Lake Township, Van Wert before that, Salina in 2019, but also a spate of tornadoes through Dayton. Could you just share a little bit about how LDR works when those communities experience something like a tornado? What's the process?
Sure. Yeah, so Dayton is a prime example, kind of it. So I'll use that as a local piece, because I was also on the ground in Salina and worked and kind of walked through some of that process. So really, LDR's role, if I can summarize it, is threefold, really looking at engagement first. So what we're doing today, really engaging with congregations, engaging with synods, engaging with Lutheran social service agencies to build relationships, build awareness, partnerships, so that when something happens, we all can work together. Our role is not to be an implementing partner. Our role is really to accompany local communities through that process. So the other two pieces are then, really we focus on education. So technical assistance, we're working right now on some online learning, some e-courses that can be accessible on an on-demand fashion, also looking at potential for just-in-time training to be able to make that more accessible to more people across the country. Just saying, here's what LDR is, here's what some of the nuts and bolts that you need to know after a disaster in your community, but also can be accessed proactively as a preparedness and mitigation strategy as you move forward. So we'll look later, probably mid 2022, we'll be kind of rolling out some of those e-courses, so under the education front. So really the training piece has always been a hallmark of LDR. And then as the third piece is equipping. So really looking at, that's our grant making side. So offering funding resources in 3 areas. So relief. So those are really smaller, immediate, kind of shorter implementation timeframe grants. So say, the Salina tornado, a perfect example is after Salina, we applied to LDR for an immediate relief grant of $10,000. And then that was through the Purple Door Church in Salina, and they were able to leverage gift cards. So they were actually partnered with a local bank there who was able to give them gift cards at no cost. So effectively using all of that $10,000 for direct assistance, and then they were able to hand those gift cards out to the folks that needed it most as they were doing food. They were also doing food distribution and meals. They were actually walking through communities and handing out meals in the neighborhoods that were impacted. So that's kind of the relief piece, really looking at immediate, how do you mitigate further damage, board up houses, put tarps on houses, make sure that people have enough food, water, temporary shelter, et cetera. And then the second piece of our grant making is recovery grants. So those are kind of the bread and butter, if you think about it in terms of how things work long term. Those really are looking at, that can be a year, multi-year grants. A lot of times what we find in the field is that capacity is a little bit limited, so it's helpful to be able to staff up So those can be, and it's hard to raise money for staffing, but it's hard to deliver high quality services if you don't have the staff capacity to actually deliver that service. So a lot of times some of those grants may look like, a construction coordinator, a case manager, a recovery coordinator, a pastor that might have some extra time who, is able to serve in some of those capacities. So offsetting some of that funding. And then the third piece is resilience. So really looking at that's kind of preparedness, mitigation, innovative ways, interesting programs that a synod or a social ministry organization might want to undertake, just to say, how do we build resilience in our community? How do we build, additional disaster capacity so that we're ready when something happens? So those are really the three of engagement, education, and equipping, with the ultimate goal to empower local communities and build greater resilience that way. So quick other example of a recovery grant around the Dayton tornado. So that would be, and I've got a story that I'll share later that kind of ties into this, but through funding from LDR, the long-term recovery group in Dayton was able to hire a construction manager to then coordinate all the reconstruction. And so that position had been on board for almost 2.5 years now. But they were able to, that worked with, there were about 2,200 cases that were, or households that were impacted, that went through the case management process. And so most of those had suffered construction related damage to homes and needed repair or rebuilding. So that position was able to coordinate the assessment and estimation project, and then kind of coordinate with volunteers, working with Mennonite Disaster Service, as well as Church of the Brethren disaster response teams, to then repair those homes as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of the process. As far as how to access LDR, I was telling the bishop, really, that is, we work best through synods. So I would say if something happens in your jurisdiction and your congregation, the first call is to the synod. And then, I would always encourage synod staff to be in conversation with us as well. So it's kind of the way we look at disaster responses. It's based on capacity. So if the local community has the capacity to respond and meet the needs that were caused by a disaster, then the local community would do that. And then when capacity is overwhelmed, that's when, you request assistance. So then keep the bishop informed, keep the synod staff informed. And then if that goes beyond the capacity of the synod, then that would very much be in our wheelhouse as well. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to wait until a disaster happens to get in touch with us, but we try to work and empower synods and social ministry organizations on the ground as much as we can, because right now we are a staff of 1 and 2 half-time positions on the domestic side. So we're in the midst of a transition ourselves with, as you all probably well know, the church-wide reorganization that is Future Church. So we're a little bit in transition ourselves, but continue to maintain that commitment to support and accompany synods and congregations and social ministry organizations. So I'll hand it back to you, Bishop.
Thanks, John. As I think about kind of the concentric circles and working out more further into the neighbors, to our neighbors and to the world, to the community. So we have global companions that we've been in partnership for a long time in Tanzania and in Serbia and in Mexico. I wonder if you could share kind of any of the work that LDR is doing internationally in those places.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's interesting with I mentioned Future Church. With our Future Church reorganization now, LDR US and LDR International are on the same team for the first time. So I've gotten to learn a lot more about the international process, the international connections, and the international program partners. So I can speak a little bit to specifically, I'll start with Tanzania. And so on the international side, the work looks a little bit different because the LDR International really works through ecumenical partners across the world. And so they are the implementing partner. So similar to on the US side, LDR International is not the implementing partner. A lot of the partnerships go through those ecumenical partners. So in Tanzania, for example, at the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Tanzania, there is a project to empower community members in Singida and Ruvuma and Mtwara, Tanzania, to develop the ability to critically utilize media for their social development and spread awareness of COVID-19. Additionally, training is going to be held for young people who then also can take those learnings back to their communities. And that was a 2021 grant, and there have been a couple other projects, a few other projects through the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Tanzania as well. For example, to assist families affected by the heavy rains and flooding in 2020 in 5 communities like Lake Tanganyika. I'm sorry if I butcher the name, Meru, Mwanga, and Northern Ulanga Kilombero. And those activities are similar to what I mentioned in our relief grants of distributing food, clothing, temporary shelter, and etc. So that's a couple examples of in Tanzania, and I can hop to Serbia. And in Serbia, our ecumenical partner right now is the Ecumenical Humanitarian Organization, or EHO. And one of the pieces from this year is to continue to conduct educational activities to support 136 refugee women and children at the SID Reception Center in Serbia. And so those workshops for women will be held to teach glass painting, painting t-shirts and bags, decoupage crafts, candles, soaps, and sewing protective masks. So really marketable skills. And then to support children's education is really the primary education piece is there as well in Serbia. And that's refugees from all over as they move through and migrate for various reasons. In Mexico, one of the current projects is through the Asociación Mexicana de Transformación Rural y Urbana. It's EMEXRA. And they conduct humanitarian assistance to communities in Tabasco, Mexico, who were affected by Hurricanes Eta and Iota and flooding. Those activities are similar as far as distributing food, hygiene kits, but also rehabilitating livelihoods. For example, fishing boat repairs, distributing seeds for crops, and then also providing some spiritual and emotional care workshops. And one others is the Cruzando Fronteras, the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona, a partnership and continued relief assistance to 300 asylum seekers who are currently residing in the La Casa Family Shelter in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. And those activities include providing food, clothes, and health assessments for migrants, legal assistance, and transportation to help migrants contact their families. And so those are really just a few examples specific to Tanzania, Serbia, and Mexico. And there are a lot more of those examples across the nation or across the world where LDR International engages as well. So really the scope of Lutheran Disaster Response is truly global, and the impact is very widespread. So having partnerships with synods and dedicated supporters like yourselves really makes all of that happen. So we couldn't do that work without your generous support. So those are the pieces from those 3 countries. So I'll throw the mic back to you, Bishop.
Sure, thank you. I really appreciate the magazine you folks put out, the Thrive magazine. I think it's on pages 3 and 4, where there's a map of the globe and a map of the United States. And I think I remember reading that LDR is actively involved in 46 states and territories in 2020, and something like 53 countries. And it delighted me to hear that the work in Tanzania involved appropriate and true information about the COVID-19 pandemic, because I think early on, folks were receiving misinformation and even disinformation from the government. So it's wonderful to see that our global partners are being served in a wonderful way. I wonder, before we open it up for questions, as you've done this work these many years, is there a story? Is there something that is there a story that's touched your heart that you might be willing to share with us?
Sure. So I've actually have two stories. One particularly that I thought was pertinent and might relate for you guys, since it's from the 2019 Memorial Day Dayton tornadoes. And so this story is about Christine, who lives in Dayton and lives with her daughter Kansas. And so during that weekend of Memorial Day in 2019, this is when there was an EF4 tornado that came through Dayton, and that EF4 tornado went through a neighborhood called Old North Dayton. And that's where Christine and her daughter Kansas, as well as her father, lived in next door houses. And the house that Christine and Kansas lived in, they had bought from her parents, and were slowly beginning to make necessary repairs. And then about that time, that's when the tornado hit. They took shelter. Thankfully, they had a basement. They were able to take shelter in the basement and were both safe. But the tornado ripped the roof completely off the house and damaged the foundation. And so Christine said, and this tornado happened in the middle of the night. So about 11 o'clock at night, between 10:30 and 11 o'clock. And so the roof and siding of Christine's house were torn off and windows shattered. And so she said that she went out in the dark and looked up and she saw the sky. All the trees and everything was down, and it was just unbelievable. So Christine worked full time, was able to, but she didn't have insurance. She wasn't able to keep that and make the ends meet. So she was doing as best she could to pay for temporary shelter, but was really struggling to figure out how she was going to move forward. She loved her neighborhood and loved her house, and was able to get in touch with case managers through the Miami Valley Long-Term Recovery Group, which was a cohort of local organizations working together to serve people impacted by the tornadoes. And so she had gotten cited by the city for a dangerous structure, and she was trying to figure out how to not get cited and not have fees rack up. So the Long-Term Recovery Group was able to leverage a local contractor who donated the labor to demolish her home, and then through a partnership with the Long-Term Recovery Group, and specifically with Habitat for Humanity, they rebuilt Christine's home completely. And in March 2021, she and her daughter moved back in. And so LDR's role in that, as I had mentioned earlier, was LDR played a key role in forming that long-term recovery group that facilitated all of that assistance, and also funded a construction coordination function for the long-term recovery group through LDR's local partner there, which initially was Lutheran Social Services of Central Ohio, and now is Osterland Services for Youth. And so through that, your gifts made that possible. I can actually show you a picture, if I can share my screen really quickly, of Christine's completed house. So this was the dedication, and this is Norm Miozzi, who's the executive director of Dayton Area Habitat, and this is these folks are from Brethren Disaster Relief, and these folks are Crossroads Church volunteers that really worked tirelessly to assist in rebuilding the home. You'll notice this home next to her. This is her father's home as well, and that home was rebuilt too. And this was a street in Old North Dayton where numerous houses were destroyed, and that would not have been able to be rebuilt would it not have been through the generosity of local community members and contributions to the Dayton Foundation, who who volunteered to kind of be the fiscal agent for all those long-term recovery funds. So that is Christine and Kansas at the dedication of their new home in Old North Dayton. And I actually, Bishop, I have another story from Serbia, from one of the partners there, if you'd
Please,
like me to
yeah.
share. Okay.
It's one of our global companions, so that would be delightful.
Sure. Let me switch my screen and I will show you a picture here as well. So this is Yusuf. Yusuf is 13 years old, and he migrated from Iraq. He stays at the reception center with his parents and two brothers, and he traveled with his family through Turkey, Greece, Albania, Montenegro, and Bosnia. And their goal was to reach Austria, where his oldest brother is waiting for them and for their family to finally be together after a long time apart. He spends his time in the reception center with other children mainly, and was involved in the development of an online school where he was most attracted to learning English, which helped him communicate with the other children and those other folks who are present at the camp. And in the children's corner, he spends time playing chess, watching movies, and listening to music. He's also said that he'd like to learn the German language because he'll need it when he arrives in Austria. And when he grows up, his dream one day is to become a police officer. And so those are additionally, that is funded in part through, that project is funded in part through LDR International.
Thank you for sharing the gift of those powerful stories. I'm going to open it up for a few minutes now, maybe 5 minutes or so, if you might have any questions for Mr. John Pyron, who serves for Lutheran Disaster Response. And Caroline, are you able to take some of those questions folks might have?
Yeah, so we have a few, but as always, as we're going through, feel free to chat them if something sparks a different question that you might have, or email them. We're still monitoring, so not too late. If you have questions that get sparked, feel free to send them in. But one of the first questions that we got was, what are ways that people can support? Obviously, right now we're talking about offering financial support to equip disaster response as it happens, but are there any ways that you'd like to highlight as ways that people can support the work of Lutheran Disaster Response?
Sure. Obviously, that's probably the quickest and easiest way is financial support. One of the things that we're working on, as I mentioned earlier, we're in a little bit of a transition. So we're kind of in that phase of working to then be able to roll out some new initiatives and new ideas, and particularly around engagement. So I think one of the things that we'll be looking at that's always on our radar is how to better equip and educate folks in the pews to be able to do the work in the field. So you'll see us really talking a lot about how do we do volunteer coordination? How do we train folks up to be potentially response teams? So then you can be available for quote unquote deployment. So we're really working right now to standardize some of that initial training so that everyone kind of has the same information and can truly be of value and an added resource when you go into a community that has experienced a disaster. So that could look like, going to Dayton if a tornado hits, or going somewhere in Ohio locally. So we always encourage local engagement when possible. So I think, that's one piece is if you do have interest in serving in that capacity. I know that's how I got started and really got hooked in the work is working in the field. And so there always is a need for, organizing local teams and then figuring out, okay, here's what we want to do. We'd like to be trained in debris removal. We'd like to be trained to go and do roof tarping or reconstruction. So then figuring out how you can organize, whether it be at the congregational or synod level, that's always a way to engage. And then what we're going to be working on is some technology tools to be able to better coordinate and understand what capacities we have in various areas, to know we have X number of teams available in the Northwestern Ohio Synod, and they are willing to travel up to 3 hours in the in the diameter from their home to be able to go. And so that's really helpful for us to help make those placements and those local connections when a disaster occurs, to say, we know we have some teams there, we can move there. So what we hope to improve upon is really the equipping piece, and then maintaining those teams as we go forward, which has always been a challenge, and we'll continue to try to leverage technology to be able to better do that. So definitely financial support is always appreciated, but we also, the engagement piece is equally as important. So some of our focus too will be figuring out how to engage young people in a more meaningful way as well, and giving them opportunities, myself being a prime example of how service can shape your life. So I think, that's really a passion of mine too, is making sure that young people have those opportunities for service as well.
That's awesome. Kind of related to that, you talked a little bit about the two cardinal sins of disaster response. Can you share more about that, and how, since you're talking about kind of equipping people in their own communities, how do we avoid that, or like what are best practices? But yeah, the two cardinal sins.
Sure. Well, there are more than that, but we jokingly say those are kind of two of the big ones. And you'll hear the term SUVs, if you're ever in the disaster world, is spontaneous unaffiliated volunteers. And so I'll kind of talk about that first. It goes a little bit to what I was talking about how do we better equip our teams to add value and to not overstress an already overly taxed system, particularly after a disaster. So spontaneous unaffiliated volunteers are basically very well-meaning folks like myself that decide they want to go help, and so they show up. But then when they show up, maybe the coordination mechanisms are not in place yet. And so they're looking to the community to say, put me to work, what do I do? But they're not really bringing resources with them. They're not bringing kind of the knowledge with them in order to really effectively plug in and add value. So the better thing to do is really to contact local coordination points and say, what do you need? Who do you need? How can we be of assistance? What skills do you need? So that's where we could come in to say, we have that experience through various parts of our network to say, these are the skills that you need to have when you go into an event. You need to be self-sufficient. You need to be prepared to have your own, depending on when you go, whether it's a couple days after or a few weeks to a few months after, what you need to have looks very different. And then so it's, we all have servant hearts. We want to do and we want to help. But sometimes that drive to help gets in the way of actual help and assistance being helpful in the field. So it's really about coordination. So then that's where we can come in to try to work together with the Synod to figure out what does that look like to have teams who could be deployable, who could go, and then what skills do we need to help them develop before they go, so that when they get on the ground, they understand exactly what needs to happen and how to plug in. And then the second piece that I had mentioned of just, me thinking, oh, this hurricane hit Florida, and that's where the declaration was, right? It's just disasters do not respect geographical boundaries, and the state level and federal government declarations that you hear about a lot of times are only in the areas of highest impact, but that does not mean that there wasn't impact in those other areas. It just didn't meet a specific threshold to garner, in many cases, federal assistance. So for example, there was a lot of damage after Hurricane Ida in Mississippi, but Mississippi didn't receive a federal declaration, so no FEMA assistance was available for those folks. And then Alabama similarly. So really that came through Louisiana. So Louisiana got the media attention, but I think that's when we just have to know that, there will be vulnerable people who are impacted in a broad area, and the media attention will not really show the depth and breadth of that. So, that's where kind of the meeting people at the margins, meeting people where they are, that's what we always try to focus on is, those areas that may get forgotten, the folks that may fall through the cracks inadvertently, but still have, could use that assistance to be able to an accompaniment to be able to stand back up and recover.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So throughout all this, you've used the word accompany a lot. So what is the relationship, or the difference in relationship from an accompanying approach to a different sort of disaster response approach? Because it seems like a huge part of what Lutheran Disaster Response tries to do.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting too, because accompaniment is a concept that was really resident in the global mission unit in pre-future church days at Churchwide, and hadn't necessarily been fully adopted in the domestic mission unit where LDR US sat. But really, as I began to learn about accompaniment, I realized that we were already doing that. Our approach has always been to focus on, we always say, if you've seen one disaster, you've seen one disaster, because every community is different. And so though there are overarching things that stay the same across the board, there are differences per each community. So you really have to focus on knowing the local community, empowering the local community to be able to stand up and respond to its own needs, just as in our approach with individual and household recovery of partnering with households to empower them to own their own recovery. So that means, that's the sustainability piece, is really walking alongside someone. So it's a hand up versus a handout. It's really building capacity. It's embedding that capacity as locally as possible, so that then when something else happens, that community still has some of that capacity in order to respond again, versus having to call someone from outside the community to come in and do something for them. We work to engender that knowledge and expertise within the local community. So in essence, my philosophy would always be, I'm trying to work myself out of a job, because the more people that know what I know and have that experience, then the less need there would be for a national entity to come into a community and do something for that community. It would really be about building capacity and sustainability at the local level. So we may never actually get there, because I think there will always be a need for coordination, if nothing else, at state and national levels. But really saying, we recognize that synods and congregations, you are the front line, you are the hands and feet, and we're here to support you. So really helping empower you to do that work and to serve in your communities, because the church is the center of the community, and that's where you can really build. You build congregational vitality when your congregation is out doing work. People see your congregation doing work and they want to join that congregation because they see what you're doing. And then it becomes visible, and then it moves from there. So I always tell people at congregational levels to say, after a disaster, you don't have to know everything, but you have to do something. And a lot of times it doesn't matter exactly what you do. It's just showing up, whether it's handing out water, whether it's going and helping move branches out of your neighbor's yard. It's really about showing up. And then if you have the heart for it, we can teach you the skills that you need. It's harder to teach the heart piece, but that's the piece that is beautiful about the church, is we have the heart, and we can easily stack the information that you need to be able to support the work that you want to do.
Yeah. We've got, we're watching time here, but we've got two last questions. So one that popped up in the chat from Ken Politz. So he asked, does LDR typically, or at least here in the US, have boots on the ground when a disaster happens? And what does kind of that timeline from when a disaster happens and then response time if LDR is needed?
Sure. So it really depends. That's a great question, Ken. It really depends on the local capacity. So as far as I mentioned, our staff capacity at the national level right now is staff-wise is very limited. So whereas I would love to be on the ground to respond and wield a chainsaw to every event that needs a chainsaw, it's not feasible for us to do, but that's where we're working towards to say, we'd love to have that capacity immediately after an event. So say something happens in Indiana, in Southern Indiana or Eastern Indiana, and there's a team that is grown and developed in Northwestern Ohio Synod, then that would be great for us to know about, to then say we could help make a connection. Hey, there's a team that needs, or there's a community that needs debris removal assistance, and the team in Northwestern Ohio Synod has done debris removal, then we can say, hey, let's make the connection. So then we don't necessarily have to have quote unquote boots on the ground, but we have boots on the ground through you. And, that's the way I look at it, is we're all LDR together. I represent LDR at the national level, but really LDR is more than church-wide. It's more than synods. It's more than congregations. It's all of us together. So that's what's unique and very, I think, compelling about LDR, is that we work in this as a movement together. And then we all have specific roles to be able to play. So it's not, we send people all the time. It's really, we would look to you to say something regional happens. Well, we know Northwestern Ohio Synod has a passion for this and has some capacity. Let's see if they're available to be able to go. So in areas where there's not a high density of Lutherans, it might look a little bit different. We may work through, an ecumenical partner here, or partnerships through a local congregation or the synod, or so it really looks a little bit different depending on where you are in the country and depending on what the capacity is at the local level.
Yeah. So last question. So you've mentioned that your journey through working disaster response has, you've experienced quite a bit, and just in other conversations, you've mentioned that the work is changing, especially with climate change impacting communities a lot more in a much more visceral way. So you've experienced a lot. Where do you find hope in this work as you continue to walk alongside communities?
That's a great question. And it's hard. I'll be honest, it's really difficult. This past year for me has been the most difficult of I turned 40 this year. So the 40 years that I've been on the planet, this one has been the hardest. I think, the compounding nature of every disaster that we've experienced, whether it be COVID, the various hurricanes, floods, wildfires, it's hard. It's hard to get slammed with that over and over again, particularly in our world where it's, media profusion all the time. You see all the big ones, but really it's conversations like these that give me hope of, having connections with folks on the ground who are doing something. It doesn't, I tend to get, one of the biggest challenges for me is being at the national level. I'm already kind of a macro thinker. And so I can get buried in that macro thinking sometimes. And so it's really great to be able to be back. And that's what I love about disaster response in general is, particularly in response efforts, you can get out into a front yard of somebody's home where there are trees down everywhere and spend all day cutting trees down for one household. And, you don't think about the fact that there are, 12 other households on that street that need assistance. You just see, the person that you had helped. I remember many places where seniors who couldn't get out of their homes, their wheelchair ramp had been destroyed. They needed to get out. And the first thing was just clearing the trees out. And then even though there was a huge road to recovery ahead of them, just the fact of having a clear yard gave them some peace of mind. So I think it's really being present with those folks and, like you guys who really work together with your neighbors to assist them and help after disasters that gives me the most hope.
Thank you.
John, thank you so much. We're so grateful for your time with us, for the information that you've shared and how it has touched our hearts. Dear friends of Christ, 2021 is the year of generosity. And I would love for us to end 2021 by giving back to the greater church for the renewal of the world. That is a part of our mission here in the Northwestern Ohio Synod. And when I was at the last Conference of Bishops meeting, we heard about the work that Lutheran Disaster Response was doing around the world and how they were being stretched. And I just felt that God was calling us to help. And so I want to invite you to take the opportunity before the end of the year. Rachel and I are committed to giving generously. The congregation where we worship, they're also going to be giving generously to Lutheran Disaster Response. When I was a parish pastor, we would often take the opportunity, if we had a generous year and we had a surplus at the end of the year, we would work really hard to give that away. And that may be a place where you could possibly do that. We would take a Christmas Eve offering and we would give it away to places that were in great need. So we'll just invite you to take the opportunity before the end of the year to make a gift to Lutheran Disaster Response, that we might partner with the living God to renew the world. And Kayla, just in a couple minutes that we have left, can you tell us how we might do that and what some the resources that are available to do that?
Absolutely. So if you visit our website right now, you'll find a landing page for the Year of Generosity Year-End Ask. And on this page, you'll find the opportunity to donate towards the $100,000 we're seeking to together raise to support the work of Lutheran Disaster Response. And if you continue to scroll down, you'll find worship resources, bulletin inserts, stories, videos that you can feel free to use in your parish as you talk about the great work of Lutheran Disaster Response. If you continue to scroll down, you'll find some newsletter blurbs that you can include in your communications with your congregation, a letter from Bishop that you're more than welcome to use in any way that would be helpful, and that great link to the Thrive resource that we were talking about, the LDR 2021 annual report. If physical copies of that document would be helpful, we are more than happy to help connect you with some of those resources. Additionally, if it would be helpful for a member of staff to come and give a temple talk or share a little bit more about the work of LDR, we would be happy to do that. This is a great time to imagine some Christmas Eve offering, Thanksgiving offering to possibly benefit Lutheran Disaster Response in this year-end ask together. We've heard folks interested in doing bake sales with youth to raise money for LDR. Year-end budgetary surplus would be a great place to share the generosity that folks have shown to your congregation.
Thank you, Kayla. John, once again, thank you for your presence with us. We are grateful for the work that God has called you to do. And dear friends in Christ, I'm also grateful for all of you, for your generosity, for your time that we've been able to spend together, learning about the mission of Lutheran Disaster Response and the great work that they do. I want to wish you a blessed Thanksgiving. And I think I'll end this time with a blessing. Receive the blessing. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord's face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace and serve the poor.
Thank you all.
Good to be with you, friends.
Everyone.
God's peace.
Peace be with you.
Peace be with you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Louisa.
Peace.
God's peace be with you.
And with you also. So good to see you all.